Hi everybody, good evening. Welcome to the webinar. It's Tuesday, May 10th, 2016. So a couple of disclaimers or pieces of introduction for this webinar. First of all, this is a review of the book You Are Here by Thich, Nhat, Hanh. And I want to be clear, I'm not a Buddhist. I'm not selling Buddhism here. But I think that this is an opportunity for us to look at some principles, some ideas that can be helpful or informative as parents. This is not a systemic review of Buddhism, but rather going point by point or principle by principle that Thich Nhat Hanh teaches in this book, and then offering it to you as some wisdom, some idea, some principle that we can use in parenting. And dialectical behavioral therapy, they borrow from Buddhism. Dialectical behavioral therapy, some of you might know, is a research-proven method of therapy that is used with borderline personality disorders and other severe diagnoses. And so there's a lot of wisdom in it that we can borrow and we can learn and we can lend to it. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to go quote by quote, and then I'm going to spend a little time talking about how I think those things apply or translate to parent education, to psychology. So with that introduction, let me get into some pre-quote quotes to kind of set the context for this evening. From Jamie Gill's book, The Forms of Life, no thinking, no science, no reason, no cultural principles have been able to completely transcend their context. Thus, as in ordinary language, it is the context, not the object, that most often determines the object's meaning and significance. In other words, what she's saying here is that there's no thing out there in the history of time that in and of itself defines itself. It's defined in the context of its time, of its place. She's talking about the importance of context, the importance of the surrounding and the ecosystem and the time where one lives or one observes in order to make meaning out of it. It's really talking about the emphasis of context. And if there's something that I think is maybe more important than any other principle in psychology and understanding how human beings work and how we can heal, it's understanding their context. By understanding a human being's context, we start to make meaning out of their symptoms, out of their behaviors, out of their struggles. And with that understanding, then we can heal. In other words, when we see somebody developing an addiction, we understand where they came from. We take a look at what hurts them. We understand why they started medicating. We understand their genetic background. We understand the time and place and they live, and we start to understand them more. So context is really important. Part of the business of psychotherapy, she goes on to say, is to discover and create alternate experiences for thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and beliefs. This is undertaken in the service of freeing people to be able to re-experience themselves in a safe but different context. The virtue of talking to an empathic and accepting person who has a different base is that it quickly illuminates one's own. That is an idea about how psychotherapy can be so helpful. You walk into a room, you walk into a session, your children come into our program, one of our programs, and they have a different experience, a different reaction from their peers, from the authority figures, from the therapist, from the staff in the group. And then they begin to understand the context that they came from. They begin to understand all of the implied rules and roles, all of the covert and unspoken messages, because they have a different reaction. And that's really a big part of what psychotherapy is you're trying to create a different experience. I talk about this all the time when training our staff. Therapy is not psychology. Psychology is diagnoses, it's principles, it's labels, it's symptoms, it's descriptions. Therapy is a different relationship. And so people can study psychology. That doesn't mean they can do therapy. And people can be very gifted in psychology. That doesn't mean they're any good at doing therapy. Therapy is having a different kind of response with your client. And that kind of response that you have with your client starts to change them. They start to consider new ideas and new thoughts in the process. And that's confusing for many people because they think the more intelligent, the more gifted a therapist is in their knowledge base, their academic rigor, the better they are as a therapist. And that may not be at all true. In fact, I know many very, very intelligent psychologists and therapists who are average or below average at therapy. And then I know some who are very average in their knowledge base of psychology that are gifted clinicians because of their capacity to interact with clients in a healing, helpful way. A couple of more quotes to set this out and to really introduce the idea of the webinar this evening. From the book You Are Here, the book that we're reviewing this evening, getting in touch with the beauty of nature makes life much more beautiful, much more real. And the more mindful and concentrated you are, the more deeply the sunset will reveal itself to you. Your happiness is multiplied by 10, by 20. Look at a leaf or a flower with mindfulness. Listen to the song of a bird, and you will get in touch more deeply. You will get much more deeply in touch with them. After a minute of this practice, your joy will increase, your breathing will become deeper and more gentle, and this gentleness and depth will influence your body. Mindfulness is an idea in psychology and also in Eastern thought, in Buddhism, where we concentrate, where we remove all the noise and all the distractions, and we deeply pay attention to the thing that we're doing or observing or where we are. We can observe our thoughts mindfully. We can eat and chew our food mindfully. We can feel our feelings mindfully. We can listen to somebody else express themselves mindfully. And when we do that, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this idea of it opening up for us, becoming a much richer process for it. So, and I think that therapy is a kind of mindfulness. Therapy is a concentration on what I perceive, what I think, what I believe, what I feel, what I want, what I can and can't control. Although it's a talking kind of mindfulness, often, it still is a mindfulness or a concentration. So for all of you, parents, learning to feel, learning to understand what you think, what you want, what you believe, is a practice of mindfulness. We can borrow or translate that from Buddhism, from the book You Are Here. The goal of life, I love this quote from Joseph Campbell. I've seen it before, but I saw it at a conference, at a presentation that our psychiatrist and Caitlin Tharaldson gave this last weekend in Boston. They had this quote on the board. The goal of life is to make your heartbeat match the beat of the universe, to match your nature with nature. And so the more we get in tune with what is, the more we embrace what is, the more we radically accept what is, the more we understand and listen and pay attention to what is, the less we are at odds with it, the less suffering occurs, right? And the most amazing things happen when our heartbeat matches the universe, when our nature lines up with nature. We start to experience a feeling of liberation, of freedom. Sometimes we even start to consider that we have control over things because we're so lined up with it. That's really the principle in hypnosis or in trance. You line yourself up with the person that you're putting in trance, so much so that you start to make suggestions to them and they start to follow very easily. So learning to understand, learning to listen, that's a lot what I do, what we do in therapy. We get so lined up with the client, so in tune with what the client is going through, they start to feel that resonance, that alignment, and then the smallest of suggestions becomes something they're much more open to. So that's part of what we're talking about tonight. It's having that resonance with nature, with our children, with each other, instead of being at odds with it and fighting it and going against it. If you look deeply at a flower, at its freshness, at its beauty, you will see that there is also compost in it, made of garbage. The gardener had the skill to transform this garbage into compost, and with this compost he made a flower grow. The same thing is true of your happiness and your sorrow. Sorrow, fear, and depression are all a kind of garbage. These bits of garbage are all part of real life, and we must look deeply into their nature. You can practice in order to turn these bits of garbage into flowers. It is not only your love that is organic, your hate is too. So you should not throw anything out. All you have to do is learn how to transform your garbage into flowers. And that's a very Buddhist idea. But the idea is to embrace everything, to understand that our pain is connected to our joy, that our sadness and sorrow is connected to our love, that our fear is connected to our passion, to our want, that our hatred is connected to all sorts of wonderful things. And when we start to embrace those things instead of remain at odds with them in ourselves or in that of our children, we can learn how to transform it into something beautiful, something joyful. I talk about this around Thanksgiving time, this idea of how do we develop gratitude? One of the ways that we develop gratitude is by embracing everything. And on the other side of it, one of the ways we develop depression is by trying not to feel some things. And when we practice not feeling something, we develop a depression, an absence, a kind of a psychological dent, if you will, a depression, if you will. And we take with that all the energy, all the passion, all the life with it. And we call it a mental health disorder. So learning to embrace everything. In Western philosophies and cultures, sometimes we really try to avoid pain. And in Eastern philosophies, they try to embrace it. Or at least in this idea that Thich is putting across, Thich Nhat is putting across with pain and sadness and hurt and hate. Let's talk about compassion and how it's a part of the process, especially as it applies to parenting. For me, he says, the kingdom of God is where mindfulness exists and is a kingdom where there is compassion. The kingdom of God, the Pure Land, is not a place where there is no suffering. Many people aspire to go to a place where pain and suffering do not exist, a place where there is only happiness. This is a rather dangerous idea, for compassion is not possible without pain and suffering. It is only when we enter into contact with suffering that understanding and compassion can be born. Without suffering, we do not have the opportunity to cultivate compassion and understanding. Without understanding, there can be no true love. If you do not have compassion in your heart, you do not have any happiness. So again, he's starting, it's very philosophical, very poetic, I understand, but he's starting to paint a picture to connect all these things together. Things that we want to throw off and get rid of and avoid. And when we can see their necessary connection to the greater whole, we can develop a greater fullness of spirit. And again, if we're at odds with the universe, with what is, right? I can remember many times being out in the wilderness program, being angry at the rain, angry at the mosquitoes, angry at the hot, scorching sun. And that was just me metaphorically being at odds with it instead of learning to embrace it. We're learning to understand it. I tell this story often where I was tempted in a freezing cold rainstorm in October several years ago to have some of the sessions in my car, which was a bit of a taboo in a wilderness therapy program. And I said to the staff in between sessions, I'll give you 5 minutes to convince me not to go to my car and have a few sessions in my car to stay warm. And he said to me, Brad, just show them how to suffer. Show the students how to suffer. And immediately I was released. Immediately I understood and saw value in suffering, saw value in the struggle, saw value in the difficulty. And instead of trying to fight it, trying to resist it. I had a student years ago ask me this question. He said, why should I trust you? You're getting paid to care about me. And I started to think about that. I started to think about this idea that I am getting paid. I do care about my students. Why would they trust me? Why would they trust any of that care, that love, that affection that I have for them? And I thought about that, and as I was driving to my therapist appointment that later on that week, I thought to myself, I'm going to ask her that question. And as I imagined myself asking her that question, I understood that I don't pay my therapist to care about me. I pay my therapist to understand me. And then love and compassion and care come automatically for her after that. So I tell this story to illustrate the connection that comes with understanding and compassion. If we have a deep understanding for somebody else, compassion automatically comes out of that. Right? It's hard to not have love and compassion for somebody when we see all of their wounds, all of their pain. Right? It's like that concept that I've taught before that says, I think it was Thoreau. It wasn't Thoreau. Oh, it was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He said, if we could read the secret history of each man's heart, we would find suffering sufficient to destroy all animosity. So the idea is if we can understand somebody, that's not a perfect quote, but it's essentially the same thing. If we could understand people, our frustration, our hatred, our disgust would dissipate, would melt away. To me, he goes on to say in that same quote, the definition of hell is simple. It is a place where there is no understanding and no compassion. We have all been to hell. We are acquainted with hell's heat, and we know that hell is in need of compassion. If there is compassion, then hell ceases to be hell. You can generate this compassion yourself if you can bring a little compassion to this place. A little bit of understanding, and it ceases to be hell. So, the most lonely, miserable, desperate place for human beings to be is a place where there is no compassion. A place where they don't feel loved, they don't feel understood. That's why, for me, some of the most spiritual places to ever be are places like a 12-step meeting or a therapy session. I think for me, that is the place where I feel closest to the divine, because it's a place where I feel the most love and grace. Going on more with understanding. In Buddhism, Thich says, it is said that love and compassion are made of one substance, which is called understanding. If you understand, you can love. But if understanding is not there, it is impossible for you to accept and love somebody. Why did he act that way? Why did he say those things? You should look deeply into those questions, and then you will see the causes of what you're dealing with. With this understanding, you stop blaming and criticizing. Your compassion is born of your understanding of the situation. So I think when I hear parents ask, and many of them do, the question, why did she do this? Why does she do this? Why is he doing this? Right? They seek for that understanding. I think what happens is they lose touch with the other. Right? And when they lose touch with the other feels alone. The other feels a lack of compassion. And so to parents, I say, you may not know why. It may be hard to understand, but that is your job. That is your journey. To understand and then to have compassion and love. It doesn't mean, I almost hesitated to bring this up, but for fear that somebody might hear this and hear this incorrectly. It doesn't mean that you don't get to set boundaries. You absolutely do. I think sometimes people think when we talk about compassion, when we talk about understanding, that people have to give up themselves in the process, allow themselves to be exposed to abuse. And you absolutely are allowed to say, I can't do this. I can't be here. Right? But we can do that with love, with courage, and with compassion, instead of with rage and anger and disgust in the process. And the difference is one is about me and my capacity, and one is about me making a judgment on you. Being present is the first thing. The first miracle of mindfulness is our true presence, being here, present and totally alive. Then if you are really here, something else will also be here, the presence of the other. You are here, and the other is here. It could be your lover, your partner, your son, your daughter, or your friend. The fundamental condition for recognizing the presence of the other is your own true presence. What is loving? It is recognizing the presence of the other with your love. This is not a theory, it is a practice. Whether the object of your love is your heart, your in-breath, your physical body, or your baby, whether it is your son, your daughter, your partner, your declaration of love is always the same. It is, dear one, I am here for you. If you are a father or a mother or a partner, generate your own presence, because that is the most precious gift you can offer. So part of what I put this in here because I think that it's such a fantastic example of differentiation, of intimacy, of connection. Right? I talk about this idea all the time with parents about fusion, overlap, over-identification, enmeshment is not connection. It's not intimacy. To have to believe and feel and think the same things. To not allow the other to have their anger, their sadness, their hurt, their frustration is not connection. If we are over-identified with our children, right? If we are living our lives through their eyes, if we are seeing the reflection of ourselves in them, if we are making meaning out of our success as a father and a mother based on how or what they do, we've lost them altogether. And that is why the first ingredient, the first presence in an intimate relationship is the presence of oneself. And when one can be aware of oneself, it opens one up for the possibility of being aware of another. That's why instead of, for example, in therapy, when we're teaching somebody who's been really abusive to somebody, we don't teach them to empathize first. We teach them to feel first. And when they can feel their own pain, then they recognize that in others. And it's the same with parents. The best way to teach your children empathy, the best way to encourage them to be sensitive to others is to teach and allow them to feel. That's what you've done by sending your children to us. That's what we do when we go into therapy. We learn how to feel. And the more and more we feel, the more capable we are of seeing other people's feelings, responding, recognizing, being sensitive to them. The value of being seen by somebody. I can't say this, I can't overstate this. I can't not think of a more positive contribution that we can make to each other and to our children than to see and hear them. It is, in my mind, and what I'm going to read from Thich, Nhat, Hanh, it is maybe the most important thing that we can do to help them develop esteem, confidence, get rid of self-doubt, is to see and understand them. Not judge them good or bad, not deem them wise or stupid, but just to see and hold a place for them. When the other person realizes that his or her presence has been recognized and confirmed, he or she will blossom like a flower. To be loved is to be recognized as existing. Have you looked at others in this way? If you embrace them with the energy of mindfulness, with your true presence, this energy is completely nourishing. It is like water for a flower. A flower needs water to live, and the person you love needs your presence. Your presence is the most precious gift you can give him or her. Dear one, I am here, really here for you. All of us can practice this mantra. It really works. That's really our goal, right? Can we approach somebody with what I call a dear one, what Thich Nhat Hanh calls a dear one attitude? If we can't, then we need to go somewhere. We need to excuse ourselves and find a way to cultivate that. That's where we say to our children, I can't do this. I can't have this conversation. I can't have you here right now. Because in essence, part of what we're saying is we can't be there for them in the way that Thich Nhat Hanh is describing, which is the greatest gift that I know. And the greatest gift that I've ever experienced in my life is this kind of experience in the presence of another. Learning to feel, I talk about that a lot. If something negative comes to the surface, such as your despair and anger, or the despair and anger of your spouse, you need the energy of mindfulness to embrace it. When you get angry or depressed, it is the same. You simply recognize what is there, anger, depression, and so forth, without any sense of disapproval or rejection. If you recognize emotion as existing in the moment, you will not feel upset. There's no battle to win or lose. This is the Buddhist meditation. The habits of drinking alcohol or getting angry are also you, and therefore you must treat them with great tenderness and non-violence. The essential point is not to create conflict, a fight within yourself. So again, this is about embracing. This is that same idea where the Buddha says that hatred does not cease by hatred, right? That we can't get rid of things by hating them, by being disgusted by them, by reviling them. Not long term. They'll crop up somewhere else. We'll actually be more likely, if we practice that, which is another way of talking about shame, we'll actually be more likely to be ignorant of it, blind to it, while it runs our lives. We call that denial or repression. So part of what he's saying is embrace it, sit with it, look at it, learn from it, be gentle with it. And that's the same that I talk about all the time, where if you have a symptom, if your child has a symptom, we don't chase it away with shame, with anger, with intimidation. We learn from it. In the behavioral chapter of my book, that's where I say, before you try to stop a behavior, try to spend some time understanding where it came from and what it can tell you. It's the same idea. It's the same idea in psychotherapy when we honor the defense instead of knock it down. Doing psychology is when we see a defense mechanism and we try to bowl it over, to knock it down. And what does a person who has a defense that we attack, what do? They fortify it. But if somebody comes to us with an obvious defense, a nervous habit, self-medicating, right? Denial, rationalization, justification. If they come to us with that, and we sit with it gently and we understand, then they can feel safe to pull it down one brick at a time. They can feel safe to say, I was afraid. I was afraid of being judged. I was afraid of you not liking me, not caring about me, thinking I was stupid or less than. So I had this wall up to protect myself. And I think early psychology students, naive or unpracticed therapists, will point it out a lot. We'll say, you're being defensive. You're justifying. You're rationalizing. And they imagine to themselves that this thing that they're doing is called therapy. In my mind, it's called psychology, and it's the opposite of what Thich Nhat Hanh is talking about. The Buddha said that we should not be afraid of the past, but he did warn us not to lose ourselves in it either. We should not feed our regret or pain over the past, and we should not get carried away by the past. We do not need to study and understand the past. We need to study and understand the past, however, because by looking deeply into the past, we learn a lot of things that can benefit us, the present and the future. The past is an object of our study, of our meditation, but the way to study it or meditate on it is by remaining anchored in the present moment. And so this is a lot about this story that I'm going to tell you, is a lot about how we can make meaning out of our past and learn from it. A lot of people say you can't change the past. With this idea, you actually can change the past. I mean, think about it. How many of you, if you think about your teenage years, think about the story you would tell about your teenage years when you were 20 years old. And then think about how you might tell that same period of time, how you might talk about or describe that same period of time when you were 30 years old. And now think about how you might describe that period of time, your teenage years, when you're 40 years old, and so on. Nothing has changed except for your wisdom and your experience, and yet your description of that time changes dramatically. So part of our meditation, part of our practice, part of our mindfulness, part of our therapy and going back to the past is to understand it in a different way, to honor it, to respect it, to learn from it. In one of his retreats, he told the story of a Vietnam veteran haunted by his past. The story goes something like this. The Vietnam veteran was haunted by the fact that after an ambush of his unit, he decided in a moment of rage and ultimate pain to take a bunch of sandwiches and to put poison in them, put explosives in them. And he left all of these sandwiches at the gate of a city. And moments later, children came out of that gate, and several children ate the sandwiches because they were starving. And then he sat from the tree line and watched all of these children die and bend over in pain and die in their parents' arms. And he was haunted by this experience. And he came to Thich and he said, Thich Nhat Hanh, he said, I can't change it. It's ruined. It'll never go away. I'm in inescapable pain. And Thich Nhat Hanh described to him, he said, you can change the past. If you take that event and you turn it into something else, it can change. You can now spend the rest of your life. He said there are hundreds of thousands of children that are left as orphans because of war. And you can dedicate your life to serving them and to helping them, which this Vietnam vet did do, and saved tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, young children's lives by the systems and by the things that he set up. Perhaps we have done negative things in the past that we regret. It is a mistake to think that it is no longer possible to change the situation, that it is impossible to correct the past. We can't correct the past. The past is here, right now. And if we get deeply in touch with the present, we can touch the past as well and transform it. Transforming the past is possible thanks to meditation practice. So it is what we do with it that makes it different, right? That's why so much of what I talk about with the parents that I work with is to learn to value the mistakes and the struggles. And so many parents, because of their fear, anxiety, because they love their children and they don't want their children to suffer in life, are terrified of mistakes or look at them with anxiety and fear, right? I remember one time when my daughter, my now 20-something-year-old daughter, was going through a very difficult time, and I was worried. She was in her room, and I was worried that she was going to do something to herself. I was worried that she might develop an eating disorder or cut on herself, or all the things that I'd seen all the young women do. And I was sitting in therapy talking to my therapist, and I was describing to my therapist this idea. And she said, so what would happen if she did those things? And immediately I started to think, well, we would have family therapy and we would talk about it. And we would, from that place, develop something much greater. And so this mindfulness, this practice, and again, it's not just a religion or a philosophy. It really is a part of dialectical behavioral therapy and a lot of therapies. If we can learn to embrace even what we think of as the detours, even what we think of as the pit of despair, the dark night, the confusion, the crisis, if we can learn to embrace them, to sit with them, we will have access to all of the wisdom, all of the richness that that situation has to offer. If we try to avoid it, if we run away from it, if we fight against it, we will lose access to all of that wisdom. And we'll find ourselves more and more fragile in the process. So learning to embrace the mistakes. That's why we say about your children, when it's a good report, it's good. When it's a bad report, it's good. When your children accomplish something, it's great. When your children fail at something, it's great. And by having that kind of attitude as a therapist or a parent or a staff member, right, it's a lot easier for staff and for therapists to have that attitude toward your children than it is for you to have that toward your children. It would be a lot easier for you to have that attitude toward my children than it would be for me, right? So when I hear stories about your children cutting on themselves or throwing up their food or getting drunk to the point of passing out and blacking out, I don't necessarily become afraid. I think about it as an opportunity, and I think about what's going on there? What's underneath that? What can we get out of that? And that's what this mindfulness, this practice is about. This is something I talk about all the time in parent education. Our tendency is to believe that while things are not going well outside of us, everything is just fine within us. We should not think that the problem lies outside of us. That might be the most succinct way to describe what I find many parents struggle with, which is they imagine that the solution to this equation is in their child changing. It is not. It can't be. The solution is inside of you and how you think about it, how you feel about it, how you look at it, what you believe about it. And when you solve, if you will, for lack of a better word, if you solve that equation, the impact that you have on your child becomes incredibly positive. If you change your relationship to your child and to their issues, you can have a wonderfully beautiful impact and influence on them. But if the solution is always you need to stop smoking pot, you need to stop cutting, you need to stop drinking, you need to stop being anxious, you need to stop being depressed, you need to stop being addicted to computers, if those are all the solutions, for you, that is, if those are all the solutions to your peace and to your serenity, to your meaningful life, you'll forever be powerless and forever miss the point and be less influential and less impactful. All right, here's a text-heavy slide. Embracing your pain and getting support. We are constantly trying to run away from ourselves. Our universal tendency is to try to stay away from all this suffering. So we are always trying to escape from ourselves. Society offers us all kinds of ways to do this. Television, radio, novels, magazines, cars, telephones, and so on. We abandon our territory just like that, leaving it in a state of disorder and pain. We want to run away from it. Our culture and our civilization are characterized by this tendency toward escape. But the Buddha advised us to do just the opposite. We have to come back to our territory so we can bring order and harmony to it. You are responsible for your territory, your kingdom. Do not look for the kingdom outside of it. We are afraid to face our inner pain, so we run away. But the Buddha says with great compassion, do not be afraid, my friend. Armed with this energy of mindfulness, you can cradle your pain like a baby. You can say, my pain, my distress, I am here. I am back, and I am going to take care of you. You should recognize your pain and cradle it like a baby. You should embrace your suffering in order to soothe it, calm it, and transform it. You can do that with support of your brothers and sisters in the Sangha. which is a powerful instrument. That's the community. Even the Buddha needs a Sangha. So this is an entirely different way of thinking about it. This is really what we teach in therapy. This is what we teach in communication therapy. This is why we pay so much attention to your communication. This is why we stop you and say, are you trying to get your child not to feel the way they feel, to think the way they think? They're learning from you this when you do that, which is what you learned from your parents. So when you tell your child to look on the bright side, or to think of it a different way, or to be positive, or don't be upset, when you talk about aftercare and they tell you how upset and scared they are, and you try to explain to them why they shouldn't be scared and afraid and upset, you do this kind of thing. But when we model just sitting with them and listening, it really is the communication model we teach. I can't tell you how many times I've thought about this irony that parents send their children to us to learn how to feel, because that's beneath the symptoms, right, that they're displaying, learning how to feel. And then they get on the phone, or they have their parent visit or their parent graduation experience, and they have experiences where they're trying to talk their children out of it. And I remind them, no, we're teaching them how to feel. We're teaching them how to feel their anger and hurt at you, about you, their sadness about life. When they tell you that they feel ugly, listen to them. Listen to their sadness. When they tell you that everybody hates them or judges them, listen to it. When they talk about feeling misunderstood by you, instead of telling them how you do understand, listen to it and understand it. Thank them for it. Honor it. And then they can move through it. That's how this works, instead of trying to avoid it. If you need a Dharma brother or sister to help, call on them. My brother, my sister, I have a little energy of mindfulness, but not enough to care for my pain. I need you to help me. Your Dharma brother or sister will help you. They can sit down and breathe deeply with you to provide you with support. Again, this is very philosophical language, very poetic language, but it's the same thing we teach in psychology, the same thing we teach in therapy. Ask for help. Go to AA and get community. Find a group that can support you. Find your people. That's why I talk and teach to a lot of you a lot of the time, especially during times that you're going through, like having your child away or during a crisis. You're only going to have so much energy to be around people who can't be there for you. Sometimes that's your family, your extended family, who imagine themselves being there for you but aren't, or who are trying to fix it but are really taking from you. So find therapists, find sponsors, find mentors, find meetings to go to ask for help, to ask for support. People that can show up and sit with you. And you know what I mean when you've started on this journey. You start to recognize who can sit with you and who can't. Who can listen to you without giving you advice or answers, without simple suggestions. Right? You start to learn the difference between somebody who's giving to you and somebody who's taking from you. Have you spoken with the little girl or little boy who's there, still alive in you? This little girl or little boy is suffering and carrying a lot of wounds. Now is the time to come back and embrace her or him. Take the time to come back to the little girl or the little boy and say, "Dear one, I am here for you. I know you have a great deal of grief in you. I can feel there are wounds. I am sorry I abandoned you for such a long time. Thanks to the mindfulness of breath, I am back." This is probably the best slide to illustrate what we do in our intensives. What we do in our intensives at Evoke for parents and families is we bring you back to the little child, to the wounds of your own childhood. We help you to hold them, to soothe them, to address them, so they have less control over running your life, so they don't get in the way of, ironically, what you want to accomplish in your life with your children. When we ignore them or don't pay attention to them, they run our lives. They become barriers for connection to our children. And so learning that although you have gray hair, some of you have receding hairlines, some of you have more wrinkles than others, although you have all that stuff, and all those years notched up on your belt, you still have a little child inside of you who has wounds and fears and insecurities. At least once a year in Plum Village, this is the place that Thich, Nhat, Hanh runs a lot of his retreats at, every monk kneels down before his brothers and asks them to shine light on him, meaning to tell him how they see him, to express themselves concerning his body, his feelings, his perceptions, his strengths and weaknesses. His brothers come together to provide him with the advice he needs. After having received the recommendations of his brothers, the monk prostrates deeply before them 3 times in thanks, and in the days that follow, he tries to practice in the light of their recommendations. I have this slide up because I think for parents, we think of feedback, and maybe it's because it comes this way sometimes. We think of it as failure. We think of it as criticism. We think of it as a mistake instead of an opportunity to learn from, to be informed by, and to grow from. It might be because some of the feedback we receive from our community does come with criticism and judgment and non-love. It might be because of that. But in the context of what we're doing often in therapy, when we gently coach you or ask you to say it a different way, right? Or even pay attention to your own wounds and how they show up in the sessions or the letters with your children. It's really this kind of process. But because of your wounds, because of your history, it's hard to express, to feel that gratitude for that stuff because you grew up in a context where being right was important, where not making mistakes was important, where needing that kind of help meant that you were less than. Listening is an art we must cultivate. First, you have to be able to listen to yourself before you can listen to someone else. You must not run away from yourself, but rather be very compassionate toward yourself. The practice of deep listening consists of keeping compassion alive in your heart, the whole time that you are listening. You do not listen in order to judge, criticize, or evaluate. You listen for one reason alone, to offer the other person a chance to express him or herself. Practice mindfulness of breath the whole time you are listening, and maintain this intention. I am listening in order to make it possible for her to suffer less. If you can do that, then the negative words will not affect you. What she says might be wrong. It might be sarcastic. It might be intended to hurt you or put you at fault. But as long as compassion is alive in you, you are immunized against suffering, and that is a wonderful thing. That is a lot like what I talked about last night from the 4 Agreements with Don Miguel Ruiz, where he talked about not taking anything personally. This is a lot like what I talk about with the webinar on containing or on reflective listening. Thich, Nhat, Hanh calls it deep listening. We call it reflective listening at Evoke Therapy programs. And this is a beautiful way to describe what that looks like. And I say this to people all the time. It actually gets to the point where it doesn't hurt when people intend to hurt you. It's not an effort. It becomes less effortful the more and more I grow in this process to hear somebody say vile things toward or about me, because I have compassion for them. I don't take it in. I listen to alleviate their suffering. I don't agree with it necessarily or not. In fact, I don't make any judgment about it. I just listen. I provide a place for them, a context for them to discharge it. And if I can do that, oftentimes the person can let it go, can move through it. And it's hard to do with our own children, with our own spouses. That's why therapists can help. That's why we can help your children. That's why the therapists that see my children can help them. But we can develop a greater and greater capacity through the practices in our program, the practices of mindfulness, and the practices of healthy nonviolent communication. We need to treat them with a great deal of tenderness, because the essential thing in Buddhist meditation is not to create tension, conflict, or rift within yourself. The positive elements within you are you, and the negative elements within you are you also. It is necessary for the positive elements to acknowledge and cradle the negative elements. And if you do that, a transformation will take place. There is no need for the two to do battle. In Joseph Campbell's paradigm that we talk about and that we're very informed by at Evoke Therapy Program, he talks about the dragons in our lives, the enemies in our lives, the things that we do battle with. We do battle with them in politics, in our families. We do battle with them in our communities. We do battle with them in our children. And there is this elegant idea of not fighting the dragon, but making peace with it. Coming to terms with it and understanding it. When we come to terms, when we come to peace with those negative elements, they will hand over whatever they were hoarding, whatever they were hiding, whatever was behind them, whatever they were defending. So we learn to understand, we learn to develop compassion, we learn to see, to resonate, instead of to change or have conflict. It's a different way of thinking about the symptoms and the problems in our family members. Instead of trying to do battle with them, we learn to embrace them and to understand them. I love the idea of the journey and the way that he expresses it. We talk about the journey instead of the destination all the time at Evoke. When I walk, I don't hurry to arrive. Why? Because I arrive every moment. Happiness can be attained by letting go, including letting go of your ideas about happiness. You imagine that certain conditions are necessary to your happiness, but deep looking will reveal that those notions are the very things standing in the way of happiness and making you suffer. You have to understand that happiness is not something you find at the end of the road. You have to understand that it is here now. This is the essence of the book. To get through Evoke, to get through this stage of life where your child is suffering, to get through the stage of life where you are off track or on this temporary detour, is to miss the present moment, to miss what it has to teach you, to miss what it is offering. Some of you are farther along in this and can see that and can feel that. Some of you are in the darkest part of the journey, the early part of the journey, and it's confusing, you don't understand it. And that's why you can surround yourself with other people who are farther along the journey than you. You can borrow from them their light, their wisdom, their peace, and their comfort. You can borrow their story for a while, because their story is one of having gone through it and understanding that it was that all of the opportunities were there all along. So when Thich talks about the idea of not hurrying when he walks, I share this with the students all the time because they want to get out of here. They want to get on to the next phase. They imagine that the happiness is in the next stage. The happiness is in getting back to normal life, which, by the way, they weren't very happy with while they were there. The happiness is when I thought I was younger, when I thought I would be an adult. Then I thought it was when I get married. Then I thought it was when I would have children, when I would have 2 children. Then I thought it was when I would be financially independent of my parents. Then I thought it was when I would have more success in my career, right? We know this story. And we miss all along the way all of the opportunities for happiness and for presence. Again, learning how to feel. You know that good blood circulation is necessary for the well-being of your body. The same is true of your psyche. You must live and practice in such a way that your consciousness benefits from good circulation. Bad circulation of psychological elements creates problems. Blocks of suffering, fear, jealousy, and distress are stuck in the depths of your consciousness. They cannot circulate, and they make you feel fear. That is why you have closed the door to your store consciousness, because you do not want these things to come to the surface. You are afraid of the pain in you. And so whenever there's a gap in your day, you fill it up with books or television, smartphones, so these blocks of suffering do not come up to the surface. That is what most of us do. It's a policy of embargo. You do your best to forget what is inside you and consume whatever is available to help you do that. It is in this way you create bad psychological circulation and mental problems will soon appear. This is really a commercial, an advertisement for wilderness therapy. Right? You remove all the distractions. Parents sometimes get confused why we don't want letters from extended family members, why we don't want lots of good books that are not necessarily therapeutically related, why we don't want those. Parents wonder why we do solo experiences. In my solo experiences, when I set it up for my students, I would have at least half of the solo experience, the 72 hours or so where they were sitting by themselves, to be without any reading or writing material. So they sat with themselves, and whatever was underneath came to the surface. Evoke therapy programs is a time to spend time with yourself and become acquainted with that company. See how you like that company. And so unplugging, the digital detox, sitting under a starry sky at night, sitting in the rain under a tarp on a cold October afternoon is all a part of learning to feel, learning to come to terms with everything that is inside of you. The take-home slide. The true declaration of love is, dear one, I am here for you. Dear one, I know that you are suffering. That's why I'm here for you. So this is what we aspire to with our children. And when we can't do it, we know we need to go somewhere to be fed in order to develop that capacity. Dear one, I am suffering. I need your help. When your suffering is caused by the person you love the most in the world, the pain is very great. Dear one, I am suffering deeply. I need you to help me get out of this suffering. I need you to explain this to me. So it's important for us to develop a relationship with others so that it is a dear one attitude. And when we can't do it, we need something from them. We need something to build, to fill our own reserves. Learning to water the positive. Learning to pay attention to everything, but spend our energy in the positive. Spend our focus with turning everything into something that is growing. Embracing what is. I talk about this in Western religions, they call it faith. In Eastern religions, they call it radical acceptance. It's the same thing. Faith is saying that if I tell the truth, if I do the right thing, I trust that my higher power, even though it might not be my design, even though it might not be my idea, but that my higher power will take care of me. Instead of lying or cheating or cutting corners, I'm going to show up authentically, honestly, with integrity. And my higher power promises me that it will be okay, even if it doesn't look like the way I would plan it. Radical acceptance is the same thing. It is saying what is in my life, what is going on, is supposed to be there. It trusts that the way that the river flows is the way the river is supposed to flow. And instead of trying to swim upstream or create dams to block it or change its course, that we learn to embrace it, to ride with it. In most cases, our perceptions are inaccurate and we suffer because we are too sure of them. We have to see what is happening is not death of the seed, but the transformation of the seed into a plant. Maybe they are saving you. Maybe they have figured out how to get the family into a place of enlightenment. What I've learned from this work, from being a child of this work and being an adult in this work, is that this work has the opportunity to make all of the families that participated in it greater than they would have ever been without it. I can't say it more succinctly, more clearly. The people that are involved in this work, with depression, with substance abuse, with anxiety, with school failure, with bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissism, the people that are involved with this work, the families that are involved in this work, have the potential for an incredibly rich experience in life. Much more so from the people that never are required to examine some of the things that you're required to examine. It is that idea of developing a greater capacity, a greater compassion, transforming into something new. It's easy to stay in the old. It's easy to stay there. It's easy to run away. It's easy to hide. It's easy to not transform. But your children, like this second to last bullet point suggests, might be pulling you and the family into a place of greater enlightenment. And then, of course, what you are looking for is already in you. Learning to discover it. That's really where the name evoke came from. It is our job to evoke, to pull out from you what wisdom is already there. Not to give it to you. It's not for me to give to you. It's for me to find it in you, to resonate with you. Even this webinar, my idea is if I can touch on those things in you, those seeds in you, then they can grow. And I do that by, in some ways, sharing my own story, sharing my own work. And when you recognize some of it in me or in your therapist at Evoke, or your children see it in their therapist at Evoke, then it grows in them. And that's the idea in that last bullet point. It looks like we're out of time. I might need to save questions until, I'll take one or two questions, Michael, before I close up. And then if there are any leftover ones, I will save them for next time. Great webinar, Brad. I see what Thich and you are saying. How do I develop a better ability to keep trying to better follow these tenets? Like all the books that I review, I would encourage you to read the book itself. We do at Evoke, one of the things we added when we created Evoke was more mindfulness. That could be in the form of meditation. That can be in the form of yoga or other practices. Find a practice that works for you. Find a daily meditation, a daily focus. For me, therapy is part of my meditative practice. Quietness is part of my meditative practice. Learn to find a practice that works for you. Learn to find a way to challenge your ideas, your assumptions. Put all of your assumptions up for grabs. Right? Learn to keep dying. That's the idea here. That's the invitation here. Keep dying over and over again. Don't arrive. Don't find all the answers. When you find all the answers, you're dead. Right? You know people like that in your life. They have all the answers and all the advices. And they lose the student in them. They lose the child in them. They use the beginner's mind. They lose the ability to ask questions and to learn something new from you about you, because they already have your truth settled for themselves. So find a practice that works for you. All the things that we talk about, from Al-Anon to therapy to mindful practices and meditation and yoga, find a practice that works for you and embrace it and keep dying. All right. Upcoming intensives and workshops. The workshops on the left side are experiential, multi-family, multi-parent group education. We ask all parents to go to those while their children are with us, as possible, please. The heroic journeys and the finding you are, the heroic journeys are for families. The finding you are for individual adults and parents. So this is that one slide that I talked about, finding and getting in touch with your little child and your wounds, understanding how they are impacting you. Parent support groups coming up all over the country. We're actually going to have one also in May. I'll have it on the next slide. We're going to have one in May in San Francisco. Probably in the city, not in Marin County like we usually do. We're going to have parent meetings come in Chicago, Southern California, New York City, and Philadelphia. I'll see you in Philadelphia tomorrow night. Any leftover questions, Michael, we'll just pass on until the next time. Our pursuits trips are high adventure trips for families and young adults. Go to our website. We want all families to go to 6 of these meetings while their children are with us. If you haven't gone yet, start going. Start watching and seeing how all of these principles apply. Follow us on social media for announcements, articles, pictures, inspiring quotes. The book is available on paperback, also a CD or Audible. Go to the Parent Alumni Foundation book page for recommended readings and buying them at in a place where you can 10% of your purchase goes to charity, goes toward the foundation to help families that can't afford therapy. All right, I haven't decided on the topic. We'll announce that in a couple of days, but it will be Monday, next Monday, May 16th at 7 p.m. I will see some of you tomorrow night in Philadelphia, and if you're in Long Island, I have a speaking engagement on Long Island at 7 o'clock. If you're around that area, I'll see you there. Have a great week. I hope these points of contact are helpful. Although this is a very philosophical webinar, I hope it touches on something for some of you. Some of them are more pragmatic and more about skills and techniques and concrete ideas, and this is more philosophical, and we try to embrace all of it so people can find what works for them. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you Monday, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.